Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be exploring the nature of time and eternity.
Ooh, sounds intense.
It is, it really is,
Yes.
especially as it relates to the concept of God. We've got some really fascinating material to work with this time around.
Yeah.
Excerpts from a book by William Lane Craig
Okay.
called Time and Eternity.
I've heard of them.
And to make things even more interesting, we even have some endorsements to get us started.
Oh, endorsements. Always exciting. Who are they from?
Well, we've got one from Wolfhart Pannenberg, pretty big name in theology. He calls Craig's conclusions
Let me guess.
groundbreaking.
Remarkable.
Close enough.
And then we've got Robert Russell, who promises that the book will clear up some misconceptions.
That's always helpful. Misconceptions can really muddy the waters, especially with a topic like this.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so exciting. I mean, can we really wrap our heads around something as vast as eternity?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a concept that's kind of beyond our everyday experience.
Right. But that's what we're here to explore, right? To see how far we can push our understanding.
Exactly. So I think a good place to start is with something a little more familiar.
Like what?
The Bible.
Ah, the good book. Always a solid foundation.
Have you ever wondered what the Bible actually says about time and eternity?
Of course. It's one of those questions that's always kind of lingered in the back of my mind. Like, what does it actually say, you know?
So does the Bible come right out and say that God is timeless?
Well, not exactly. It's more like we get hints and clues, especially in passages about creation.
Okay, so like Genesis 1.1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
That's a big one, for sure. And then there are others, like Proverbs 8.22-23, where wisdom...
Right. Wisdom is often seen as an attribute of God.
Right, exactly. And in that passage, wisdom is described as being brought forth before the beginning of the world.
So before the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, but are those verses really saying that time itself began with creation?
That's where the debate lies. Because some scholars look at those verses and they say, well, maybe it's just talking about the beginning of the universe, not necessarily the beginning of time itself.
I see. So who are some of the scholars who are arguing that time began with creation?
Well, one of the most prominent voices is James Barr. He's known for his work on biblical languages and concepts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he points to the phrase in Genesis, evening and morning, one day.
Evening and morning, one day.
Oh, yeah. And he says, this suggests that creation wasn't just the start of the universe, but the start of time itself. Like the very concept of a day implies that time is already flowing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right.
It's like without time, how can you even have a day?
Exactly.
So if time actually began with creation, that makes a pretty strong case for God being timeless, right?
It does, because if time had a beginning, then God would have to exist before time, which means he wouldn't be subject to it.
He would have to exist outside of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other scholars besides James Barr?
John Courage.
John Curd, okay.
He's done some fascinating work comparing the Genesis creation account to ancient Egyptian cosmogony.
Cosmogony, that's a word I haven't heard in a while.
Yeah.
It's like they study the origin of the universe, right?
Exactly. And it turns out that both the Genesis account and Egyptian cosmogony present creation as the absolute beginning of time.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Two very different cultures separated by thousands of years, both pointing to this idea that time itself had a starting point. That's pretty compelling.
Yeah, he did. But before we get into the weeds of relativity, we have to distinguish between Einstein's two big theories of relativity.
Okay, there are two.
Yeah. There's the special theory of relativity,
Okay,
or STR for short, and then there's the general theory of relativity.
GTR, got it.
So which one is the bigger challenge to the idea of divine timelessness?
Well, I'm guessing it's got to be one of those.
It's actually the special theory of relativity, or STR, that tends to cause the most head-scratching. And to really understand why, we need to go back to Isaac Newton and his idea of absolute time.
Isaac Newton, absolute time. Okay, take me back to school.
So Newton believed that time was like a universal clock, ticking away independently of anything happening in the universe. It was like the ultimate backdrop against which all events unfolded.
So absolute time is like a fixed reference frame, unchanging and unaffected by anything that happens within it.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with relative time, which is what we measure with our clocks and calendars.
Right. Okay. Relative time is time as we experience it, which can be affected by things like motion and gravity.
You got it. And Einstein's STR showed that physical time, the kind we experience, is relative. It's not fixed and absolute the way Newton thought.
Okay, I'm starting to see where the conflict arises.
Right.
If time is relative, then how can we talk about God existing outside of time? It's like, which time are we even talking about?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's
L-
a question that we're going to keep unpacking as we dive deeper into this topic.
Okay, I'm ready for it. Lead the way.
All right, buckle up. Things are about to get even more mind-bending.
Okay. My brain is definitely still processing all that stuff about relativity.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But I think I'm starting to get a handle on it.
Good.
So we were talking about how a timeless God could relate to us personally,
Right.
in a world that clearly unfolds over time.
Yeah. It's a tough one. It's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Because it's like, if God isn't bound by time the way we are, how can he understand what it's like to experience change, to have memories,
Right.
to form relationships that grow and evolve over time? It's always like, to do all that, wouldn't you need a sense of time passing?
Yeah, it's a natural thought. But Christian theology offers a starting point.
Which is
The Trinity.
the Trinity. Okay, I'm not sure I see the connection.
Okay, so the idea of the Trinity is that God isn't some isolated, solitary being.
Right.
The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit exist in this perfect, eternal relationship of love and communion.
Right, okay. So that already suggests a kind of internal dynamic within God.
Exactly. And that kind of relationship, that dynamic back and forth, it can exist even outside of time as we know it.
So even if God doesn't experience time in a linear way,
Yeah.
there's still this kind of dynamism within the Trinity.
There is a give and take.
Right, right. It's not just this static, unchanging oneness.
No, not at all. It's a relationship.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So how does that relate to God's relationship with us?
Well, some theologians argue that God can relate to us in a similar way.
Okay.
Even though we experience the flow of time,
Yeah.
God's knowledge and love encompass all of time at once. It's like he's present to us in every moment, even though he's not in time the way we are.
Okay, so it's like God is both beyond time and yet somehow present within time. That's a pretty tough concept to wrap my head around.
It is. It is.
But it does make me wonder,
Well,
what about the beginning of time? We talked about how the Big Bang suggests that the universe had a beginning.
right.
And if the universe includes time,
Yeah.
then time itself must have had a beginning. So what was God doing before that?
A classic question.
And it is, right?
Yeah.
It's like, was he just hanging out, waiting around for the right moment to create?
It's a tricky concept because if God is outside of time, how can we even talk about a before in relation to him?
It's true. Our brains are so wired to think in terms of timelines.
Right.
But when you're talking about eternity, maybe those categories just don't apply.
Exactly. And that's why some theologians have explored the idea of a metrically amorphous time before creation.
Whoa, hold on. Metrically amorphous. Now that's a mouthful. What does that even mean?
It's not as complicated as it sounds.
Okay.
Basically, it means that before creation, there may have been a kind of time that lacked any objective measure of duration, like no seconds, minutes, hours, years.
There's no way to measure it.
No, it's almost like imagining time as a vast, still ocean without any waves or currents.
Okay. Yeah, I like that image.
You see? It's there, but there's no sense of movement or flow.
So it's not that time didn't exist before creation.
Right.
It was just a completely different kind of time.
Mm.
A time that doesn't flow the way we experience it.
You got it.
Okay. That actually makes a lot of sense. It's like, it gives us a way to think about God existing before creation without having to imagine him just sitting around for like billions of years.
Exactly.
But if God existed in this immeasurable time before creation,
yeah.
wouldn't he already know everything that was going to happen?
That brings us to the topic of God's foreknowledge.
Foreknowledge, his knowledge of the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one. And it often gets tangled up with the idea of divine timelessness.
Right, because I always just assumed that if God is outside of time, he automatically knows the future.
Yeah, it's a natural assumption. But the truth is, even if God is in time, he could still have foreknowledge.
Okay, hold on. Now I'm really lost.
Yeah.
How can that be? How can God be in time and know the future?
Well, it comes down to how we understand God's knowledge and how it relates to time.
Okay, I'm listening.
So, one way to think about it is this. Even if God experiences time in a linear way, he could still have a perfect knowledge of all of time, past, present, and future all at once.
Okay, but wouldn't that mean that everything is predetermined?
That's the big question, isn't it? The question of free will versus determinism.
Right. Because if God already knows what's going to happen, how can we possibly have any real choices?
It's a classic dilemma. And it's one that we're going to need to tackle head on if we want to make any sense of this whole time and eternity thing.
All right, let's do it. I'm ready to keep exploring this fascinating and slightly terrifying topic.
Let's go.
All right, we're back, ready to wrap up this deep dive, and I gotta say my brain is officially fried.
Yeah, this has been a lot, but good Fred.
Definitely good fried.
Okay.
We've been talking about God maybe being outside of time,
Right.
but at the end of the last part, you mentioned that some folks think God might actually be in time.
I did.
It's a big shift.
It is a big shift.
So how does that work? How can a God who is in time still be, God?
Well, one of the core arguments comes from the very nature of creation.
Okay.
If we take the Big Bang seriously, and most physicists do,
Yeah.
then that means the universe had a beginning.
Right, right.
And if the universe includes time, then time itself had a beginning.
Okay, so how does that point to God being in time?
Well, if God created the universe, and the universe includes time, then it seems logical that he must have acted within time to bring about creation.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like it's hard to imagine a timeless being initiating an event that happens in time.
Exactly. So people who believe in what's called divine temporality.
Divine temporality meaning that God is in time.
Yeah. They often argue that creation was a free choice, a deliberate act that God made at a specific moment.
Okay.
And to make a choice, you kind of have to be experiencing time in some way.
Yeah, you need a before and an after to make a decision.
Exactly. So in this view, God doesn't just exist in a simple before and after with creation. He might experience a different kind of time before creation.
Like that metrically amorphous time we talked about earlier.
Right. But the point is, he's still temporal in some way. He's involved in the flow of time.
So even if he's not experiencing time exactly the way we do,
Right.
he's still participating in it somehow.
He is. And some theologians go even further and suggest that God's experience of time might be radically different from ours.
Okay, like how?
Well, maybe he perceives all of time at once, kind of like how we talked about with his knowledge.
Oh, right.
Or maybe his experience of time is more, I don't know, fluid and dynamic than our very linear perception.
Those are some wild possibilities.
They are. It makes you wonder if our language, which is so tied to our experience of time,
Yeah.
can even really capture what it's like for God.
It's like trying to describe the ocean to a fish.
Exactly. Okay, so we've explored this idea of God maybe being in time,
Right.
but let's go back to the idea of God being outside of time, which we talked about a lot in the first part.
Okay.
What are some of the, the strongest arguments for that position?
Well, I remember you mentioned something about God's perfection.
Right, that's a classic one. The reasoning goes that if God is truly perfect, then he must be immutable, unchanging.
Yeah. If God were constantly changing, it would imply some kind of lack or imperfection.
Exactly. He'd be becoming something he wasn't before.
Right.
And since time involves change, being subject to time would contradict God's absolute perfection.
Okay, yeah, I can see the logic there. But it also raises a bit of a problem for me, honestly.
What's that?
Well, if God is timeless and unchanging, how can he really be a person?
That's the big question. The personal God versus the impersonal absolute.
Because doesn't personhood require some sense of self that develops over time?
Yeah.
A self that learns and grows through experiences and relationships. All those things take time, right?
Yeah, that's a common critique of the idea of divine timelessness. Critics say it makes God too static, too abstract.
Too much of a concept, not enough of a person.
Exactly.
So how do theologians who believe in divine timelessness respond to that?
Well, they often point back to, guess what?
The Trinity.
The Trinity. Remember, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit exist in this perfect eternal relationship of love and mutual understanding.
Yeah.
So even without time as we know it, there's a deep richness, a dynamic back and forth within the Trinity.
Okay, so it's not that God is just frozen in this unchanging state.
No.
There's movement, there's dynamism within the Godhead itself that exists outside of our normal understanding of time.
Exactly. And proponents of divine timelessness argue that God relates to us in a similar way.
Yeah.
His knowledge and love aren't limited by time. He can be present to us in every moment, even though he isn't bound by the same linear flow of time that we experience.
Okay, so it's like he's both beyond time and somehow present within time, all at the same time.
It's a paradox, and a really beautiful one, I think.
It is. So we have these two powerful arguments.
Right.
One for God being in time, one for God being outside of time. Can we reconcile them? Or are we stuck with this fundamental incompatibility?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer.
Of course not.
But there have been some attempts to bridge the gap.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like what's called the two-phase model of God's existence.
Two-phase. Okay.
Hmm.
Tell me more.
So, in this model, God is timeless before creation, existing in this perfect self-sufficiency, immutability.
Okay.
But then, at the moment of creation, when time as we know it begins,
Right.
God freely chooses to enter into time, becoming temporal in his relationship with the world.
So it's like he limits himself in a way.
He does. It's a kenosis.
Kenosis, yeah. The self-emptying of God.
Right. He chooses to step into the flow of time in order to relate to us, to interact with the world he created.
It's a pretty amazing idea when you think about it.
It
It's a
is.
God who is both eternal and yet chooses to participate in the unfolding of time.
Wild.
It is wild.
Well, I think we've officially reached the limit of my brain capacity for one deep dive.
I think I'm right there with you.
We've gone from the Bible to Einstein to quantum mechanics to the Trinity. It's been quite a ride.
It has been a journey.
And I think the biggest takeaway for me is just how complex and mysterious the nature of time and eternity really is.
Yeah.
I think that's a great takeaway. And it's important to remember that even the greatest minds throughout history have wrestled with these questions.
Right. Right.
And they didn't come up with, any easy
That
answers.
keeps it all more fascinating.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. It's something we can keep pondering, keep wrestling with.
It's the kind of topic you can explore for a lifetime and still feel like you're just scratching the surface.
And isn't that fitting, given that we're talking about eternity?
It really is.
Yeah.
So to our listeners out there, if there's one question I would leave you with, it's this. If God could choose to experience time to step into the flow of moments and change, just like we do, why would he do that? What does it say about the nature of time, the nature of God, and the relationship between them? Keep exploring, keep diving deep, and who knows what amazing insights you might discover. Until next time.